Thanks a lot for coming. I'm going to take you a tour on the areas that I worked in Alaska over a 42-year period. Some pretty exciting adventures in remote places. I was really fortunate to have a chance to work on 6 of the 16 national wildlife refuges in Alaska. Spent my whole career here. Technically, I actually worked on Tetlin a little bit before it was a refuge. I'm going to take you on a tour of some of those refuges, some of the things that happened, some of the lessons I learned, and share some of my thoughts going forward now in this changed political environment and the importance of planning the landscape over a much larger level than what we're accustomed to. So let's just get a sense of what your interests are. I know a lot of you, but I don't know all of you. How many of you help count critters for your job or as a volunteer? Raise your hand. Quite a few. How many of you make decisions or recommendations about hunting and fishing regs? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you work for a land manager or make land management or land use planning decisions? Raise your hand. How many of you as a member of the public or working for an NGO or as a volunteer, how many of you try to monitor what the government agencies are doing because you care about public lands? Raise your hand. Okay. How many of you would like to see continued opportunities in the great outdoors in Alaska and where appropriate sustainable development? Raise your hand. Okay. See, I'm testing the waters here. And is there anyone here who would like to see economic development without consideration of the health of the fish and wildlife and the habitats that support them? All right. I knew he'd come to heckle me. So let's get started. So I worked 3 seasons for different agencies besides Fish and Wildlife Service. One season on a forest bug detection crew in Arizona and New Mexico, so I got to try out working for the Forest Service. And then 2 summers with National Park Service at Mount Rainier National Park. I was a trail crew worker and got to work on some pretty substantial, difficult projects in the middle of nowhere with big timber and large streams, and really got a sense of what teamwork could do in terms of just labor in a remote place. And then the next summer I worked as an interpretive park ranger, doing a lot of nature walks and campfire talks and other ranger stuff. So I came to Fairbanks to do my master's, and I did it at Kramer's Migratory Bird Refuge. And at the time, it had just been established, and so Fish and Game wanted someone to do a very general study, birds, mammals, and vegetation of the refuge, which I did, and I had these plots for bird and veg studies here in different habitat types. And the coolest thing about it is that I have seen a lot of changes since then. And Lila Towser came and did her master's 35 years later and repeated the surveys on those plots and found some pretty phenomenal changes in bird communities, mainly because of habitat succession, but also because of the loss of some of the species that are having trouble now, like rusty blackbirds and lesser yellowlegs and things like that. So I worked at Tetlin Refuge before it was a refuge. At the time they were talking about the gas pipeline to go down the Elkhorn Highway to the lower 48. And this was some stuff funded by the gas company, and I was working for Brian Kessel at the University Museum doing this work. My first job with Fish and Wildlife Service was a seasonal. Vernon Bird hired me on a crew. See if I can point out Vernon. Right there is Vernon Bird. He was the refuge biologist at the time, and Aleutian Islands Refuge didn't have much back then. It wasn't called Alaska Maritime. It was prior to ANILCA. Their vessel was the Aleutian Tern, a 65-foot war surplus harbor patrol boat, not very well suited for the open ocean. And their office was a trailer at Adak Navy Base. Nevertheless, our crew went out and did some pretty challenging things on the Western Aleutians. One of the things right now that I reflect on is that is now an endangered species. Back then it was abundant, the Steller sea lion. In the Western Aleutians, it is endangered. In the Eastern Aleutians, it's threatened. So on the trip out from Kodiak to Attu, we made multiple stops, and one of the most interesting things for me, being mostly a land biologist, terrestrial biologist, was just seeing the marine birds. There's 1 million fulmars at Chuguluk Island in the Central Aleutians, and we stopped there. 1 million fulmars. And then getting to bull deer, seeing the auklets and the Leach's storm petrels coming in, of course the puffins. Pretty phenomenal for someone who's never worked on the coast. So just to kind of familiarize geographically, the refuge headquarters at the time was at Adak. At Mchitka, they had a crew working on captive rearing of the Aleutian cackling goose. And this is Bull Deer Island. You'll see some pictures of that. It was an island that the foxes never got introduced to, so the Aleutian goose was abundant there locally. And then Agatu, where we did some fox control. There's the field camp at Bull Deer. Vernon Bird, Dennis Willington became a major player in waterfowl conservation in the Central Valley of California. David Kellyhouse became director of the Division of Wildlife Conservation. Mark Snigaroff, our person from Atka on this crew, became a very important leader in Aleut Corporation and Atka Village Corporation. And Lauren Veers was my partner for a good part of the summer. He was with the Fish and Wildlife Service Division of Animal Damage Control, where they did a lot of predator hunting. He's the guy who taught me how to shoot foxes and how to trap. So the main point of being there, and the funding was endangered species funding. The Aleutian cackling goose now is called Aleutian Canada goose, then was down to 800 birds. And so a lot of work had to be done on the nesting grounds with foxes that were preying on the birds, and also down the wintering grounds where hunting was a factor as well. The logistics in the Aleutians are pretty complicated. These are some photos for some really nice days, but even on the really nice days, there's always a pretty hefty swell. So the captain and the deckhand were pretty skilled at judging how to get people ashore safely. And you'd ride in the Zodiac from about a half mile offshore in the swell, and the deckhand would time your arrival on the beach right with the crest of a wave. You'd surf the wave in, and then everybody in the Zodiac would jump out really quick, grab the handles and pull it above the wave line. And then getting back in the boat was the opposite, where you timed it so that as soon as a wave came, you surfed back out and paddled until you got deep enough to run the motor. On Agatu, it was a fairly large island just east of Attu, and they thought at the time it was manageable. You guys, there's plenty of seats down here. You won't bother anyone if you come on down. Make yourself comfortable. Can everybody still hear back there okay? Okay, good. Okay. I didn't know much about hunting or trapping until I went on that job, and Lauren Veers taught me a lot about trapping foxes and how to actually be a really pretty good marksman. Radio communications were really sketchy back then, and we were 2 mobile crews, myself and Lauren on one, and Mark and Dave Kellyhouse on the other, on working our way around the island. And for some reason, the Aleutian turn was delayed, I think 3 weeks to a month. So here are these guys that don't have a base camp trying to survive on the island, and thanks to Mark, who was an Aleut, we learned how to live off the shore. So we supplemented our dwindling rations in our backpacks with what we could live off the shore. Got to taste a lot of different critters. My first permanent job with Fish and Wildlife Service was at Arctic Refuge. Back then, in some ways, Arctic Refuge had more going for it than it does today. As today, you know, is a pretty sad day for Arctic Refuge. Back then, they had a full-time permanent assistant refuge manager living in that rented house. His name was Jake Jacobson. And his wife, Cynthia Wentworth, was an anthropologist working for migratory birds. So they're a working couple. She worked all across the North Slope of the North Slope villages, was really good at developing good relations with Native people in the communities. I wish that trajectory would have continued, but for some reason it didn't. My role there was that was a way stop. I was supposed to do some coastal plain bird studies initially. The manager at the time was pretty worried about oncoming oil development, and we better get a handle on the bird resources of the coastal plain. So with advice that I got from my previous grad school advisor, who I'll mention later, established my first field camp at Arctic Refuge, and it was on a Pingo, just to the southwest of Kaktovik, only about 10 miles at the near the Okpillik River Delta. And myself and one other guy set up plots and spent about a month doing the initial surveys, and then a larger crew came out to visit and help us with right prior to nesting. So we were doing these transects on these plots across the Okpillik Delta. And so on the left is golden plover, and on the right, stilt sandpiper. That was my first taste of the coastal plain. Went back to Okpillik in '82, another crew in '83. After passage of ANILCA, they cranked up the coastal plain baseline resource assessment. I was the avian biologist at the time, and my job was to do studies on the coastal plain with shorebirds and waterbirds. We had three study areas that we put multiple plots on, and in the days before GPS, it wasn't easy to put those plots out there. You had to use compass and surveyor's chain and stakes and mark everything on the ground. You also had to be pretty good with use of map and compass, because if the fog rolled in, your only way to make it back to camp safely was to go on a back course on your compass through the fog. The first manager of Arctic Refuge, who I'll show a picture of in a minute, want to make sure we did not ignore the rest of the refuge. He knew oil and gas was coming, potentially coming. He wanted us to be doing work on the coastal plain, but wanted to make sure that we were also not ignoring the rest of the refuge. And so, with the advice of Brian Kessel, who said I should establish a camp on the coastal plain one summer, a camp in the mountains one summer, and then a camp on the forested south of the Brooks Range habitats. And so this was Mancha Creek. It actually flows north, but it's south side habitat. One of the cool things about it there is, you could easily, what did I do here? Okay. Gray-headed chickadee. A biologist back then that was observant, and I think still today, could make new discoveries. And the gray-headed chickadee was something that had been elusive, people wondering about it. We actually found it nesting and raising fledglings in that habitat there. Also on the sheep survey, we found the surfbird nest. So some folks here in this room helped with this, Roger and Fran. This was the first backpack route. The history on this was that there was a fatal accident on Arctic Refuge in 1970 in which a pilot and a fish and game biologist died during an aerial sheep survey. And so Abe Thayer, the manager, being a cautious pilot himself, kind of wanted us to develop some ground survey methods that might be safer and perhaps more effective to monitor sheep. So we tried a couple of different things. Fran and Roger helped this first year, and then it was repeated for 4 years while I worked there. I don't know the history after that. But the other thought was that you could watch sheep coming into a mineral lick, and you could classify them so you'd get a good age and sex composition of the herd if you watch the mineral lick. I was fortunate, I was very lucky to have spent that summer with a guy named Donald Sam. He's now passed away, but from Arctic Village. He knew a whole lot about the Brooks Range and about sheep and camping in remote areas. So it was a great summer, memorable summer working with that fellow. The other thing that was really memorable is we were scared to wear a uniform. It was a pretty tough time for federal employees. ANSCA required recommendations to Congress for setting aside public lands for conservation. There was a frequent debate in Congress that played out through the news media here in Alaska. There were frequent protests, especially leading up to the monument declarations in 1979. Pickets right in front of the federal building. The passage of ANILCA, it got even worse with them burning President Carter in effigy after ANILCA was signed. And some of the folks here today remember that when you went to work at the federal building, you went in your street clothes, then you went to the bathroom and put on your uniform and wore it inside the federal building, then you took it off before you went outside again. And we had leadership then that was pretty anal about us wearing the uniform at all costs. I want to pay tribute to some of my mentors. Bryna Kessel was curator of the University of Alaska Museum and a leader in the biology department at University of Alaska. She was my master's thesis advisor. She had been camping at Last Lake with Olaus and Marty Murie in an effort that led up to the establishment of Arctic Refuge. The neat thing about Bryna is that you could always call on her for advice, and she always kind of knew when there would be an opportunity that she should make you aware of. And so, because she had the long-established relationship with Marty Murie, she and Marty came to Alaska every few years at that time. Bryna made sure that all her graduate students had a chance to personally meet Marty and be inspired by her wisdom. It was really a great memory that I had that opportunity. And I could call on Bryna at any time, and when I was first hired at Arctic Refuge as the first biologist to do biological studies, I consulted with her. Okay, I have to fill out this form, Bryna, that wants me to estimate how many ducks are on Arctic Refuge each month of the year. And in a typical bureaucratic fashion, that's what Fish and Wildlife Service wanted. And so I tried to figure out how to do that, and she just said, well, first you need to know what species are there. So recommended, one summer on the coastal plain, one in the mountains, and one in the forested south side. I also had the chance to work with Dr. Alex Zubin and Dr. Tom Berry with the Canadian Wildlife Service. And it was quite an honor for me, being this new guy right out of graduate school that didn't know much about the Arctic at all, to be on fairly frequent phone calls with these guys regarding white-fronted geese and snow geese. And my first winter, I was invited down to Portland to help write the management plans for snow geese and white-fronted geese. And you can imagine this guy coming down from Alaska that knew nothing, standing in the shadow of these great Canadian biologists who are well published. But the amazing thing about these guys is they had no pride, they had no ego. They took me under their wing and said, you've got some observations that can help us, and so let's work together on this. So I did. With Tom Berry, there's a big area to cover from Mackenzie River Delta all the way almost to Prudhoe Bay that these snow geese would use periodically after nesting on Banks Island in Canada. And so Tom and I alternated surveys. One week he'd do it from Canada all the way to the western extent of where the geese were, and then another week I would do it, and I'd go all the way east to the eastern extent of where the geese were. And I got to see the Mackenzie Delta, and I got to see the Canadian Shield, and landed in Nunavik. And at that time, your paperwork to go to Canada wasn't a half-inch thick like it is now. You could just go and make a phone call. It was very easy to do work over there and cooperate. It's not as easy now. It was also my first real delving into the whole notion of connectivity. You've got this island off of the Mackenzie Delta, Banks Island, typical Canadian Shield Arctic granite, and then these birds depended on the wetter coastal tundra of Arctic Refuge for energizing themselves before the long migration. Soon there were more biologists at Arctic, and Dr. Gerald Garner was hired to be a supervisory biologist, and before we knew it, there were 20 biologists, either permanent or research division or technicians working at Arctic. 20 biologists. Now they have 1.5. So it was quite a time when all those studies were going on. But the one thing I really appreciated is that Dr. Garner worked closely with Harry Reynolds and with Ray Cameron on bears and caribou respectively, and that you weren't pigeonholed to be the avian biologist who never left the coastal plain. He did make sure that we had a chance to do some of the other work and get a broader exposure, and I appreciate that. It was also my first working in the international environment. Fran did a lot of it after me, with going to Canada to do caribou work as well. So Don Ross, who's in this room now, is a dear mentor of mine. He doesn't know it, but it wasn't for those years I flew with him, I would never be a pilot now. And so I flew a lot of surveys with Don. We had a couple of interesting experiences when things didn't quite work out, camping on a lake south Arctic village because we couldn't get the fuel and the whole valley was fogged in. Well, for Don it was just an overnight camp out. it was really an important thing for me to watch how he operated in those remote areas with very little support at that time. And then I'd ask questions and he'd answer them. Don, you influenced my life in a big way. Thanks for your efforts. Abe Thayer was the first manager at Arctic Refuge, also a pilot. Abe had been a law enforcement agent for Fish and Wildlife Service and then became the first manager at Arctic Refuge. Abe had had 2 engine failures of Beaver aircraft in Arctic Refuge, both mechanicals. And so Abe had become, and one of them had Marty Murray on board. So Abe had become a very cautious pilot, and it was in that background that our flying was done, as Abe would always make sure that we were trying to do it as safe as we could. He told me when I got my private license, he said the smartest thing I ever did was learn to fly and fly for Fish and Wildlife. The next smartest thing I ever did was I knew when it was time to stop flying for Fish and Wildlife. Abe's still around. We hope to visit him and do a similar recording like this with Abe here in the near future. Ugruk on the left, bowhead whale on the right, and it was a time when there weren't a lot of people up there watching those things, and it was also a time when we were in a position in a remote place like that if we made those observations, I didn't know it, but they were extremely valuable to other people that were working on those species. So I learned really quickly to be as observant as you can, even for stuff that you're not supposed to be doing, and take notes and pass it along to the right people. These are some of the permanent folks working at Arctic Refuge in 1983. There were more, and then on the lower right is the bird field crew that was at 3 different field camps in 1983, helping me with the initial avian studies on the coastal plain. When I left, Russ Oates replaced me, and Russ had the pleasure of running 6 different bird camps, I believe. I can't imagine how that was, but it must have been very challenging. And then I left during the build-up to the seismic exploration that occurred at Arctic Refuge in the mid-'80s. And so some thoughts about that. This is some photos that Don and I took. That's Camden Bay, that's the Saddle Row Chip Mountains, coastal plain of Arctic Refuge. You can see a little brownish cast to that tundra there, and snow cover when you do this kind of stuff, and this kind of stuff is really important. So some of the snow work, some of the precipitation work, some of the modeling work, and good monitoring is going to be absolutely necessary going forward if Fish and Wildlife Service takes that big step of being told to do that. And all the more power to everyone in this room to make sure that gets done right if it's done. And also remember that this is where the idea of establishing our Arctic Refuge happened at Last Lake on the Sheenjek, and that the incredible wilderness values of Arctic Refuge, the incredible wildland values of the part that's not designated wilderness, we need to stand firm and be good stewards. I moved to Selwick Refuge because I was interested in flying. I became the first pilot stationed out there for Fish and Wildlife Service. I was assistant refuge manager and pilot. Kotzebue is a pretty isolated spot. It's also got pretty severe winter storms, and at the time the Fish and Wildlife Service had very little for facilities. 2 trailers where the manager and assistant manager lived, no hangar, and a rented office and no shop. And so we relied on the local people a lot for help. And I remember many times going out to fly and the plane was buried up to its struts in drifted snow, and it'd take half a day to dig it out. And then I'd go to fly and find out that the fuselage was full of 100 pounds of wind-packed snow. So I'd have to find someone that would help me and let me take it into their hangar to thaw it out. So everybody helped everybody else. It was quite a good time learning to get along with other folks. And back then, the manager, Kent Hall, already started hiring local people in 1982 when he moved out there. And so Selwick Refuge has a long track record of working well with the local village people. And my dear wife Pam, who's in the audience here, was a camp correspondence teacher, and her job was to go out to these remote camps where people lived and help the parents and the students do their correspondence education. The side benefit to me was that we got to know some of these families pretty well, and that I wasn't automatically rejected as a government employee. She had an easier time with acceptance because her mission was helping people. I had less of an easy time because I'm from the government, and we say we're here to help you, but a lot of times we don't tell the truth. So I want to also mention that it was my first experience with Iñupiaq family. They were my mentors, my first mentors on learning as much as possible about the environment from the native perspective. Bob and Carrie Yule. Carrie did give me my Iñupiaq name, which is Ayaknayak, which is just I reminded her of someone she knew a long time ago. Bob has an incredible wealth of writing. They've both passed on, but there's an incredible wealth of writing that Bob did on his observations at those two locations, Suningrik, his winter camp, and Sisolak, his summer camp. They rarely came to Kotzebue except for logistical support. One of the last Super Cubs to roll off the assembly line from the Piper factory. November 91251 was the one I was assigned, and being the first pilot, we had to figure out how to access all different parts of the refuge for doing our job, both on floats and on skis. A lot of times I learned real quickly that it's best not to try and get to Kotzebue, that I had to spend the night at the refuge cabin or at the rented building in Selawik because I couldn't go through the fog to get back for that night. Most of the new Alaska Lands Act refuges were mainly waterfowl refuges, and the real interest on the part of the managers and biologists was to start explaining the differences in waterfowl abundance and productivity. And so different refuges had different approaches at the time. We were all experimenting. This refuge here used 60 random wetlands, and my job was to visit them twice a summer, once for the dabbler duck survey, once for the diver duck survey. I'd fly myself out, and then one other person drop them at a lake, and they'd spend a few hours doing observations, and then I'd move them. We then later branched out to doing work with wetland vegetation and water chemistry to try and explain some of the differences in productivity that we were observing. So we had a larger crew, and I had the challenge of supporting that crew and supervising them from a distance in Kotzebue with a one-seat airplane. So that was quite a challenge. A lot of trips, a lot of takeoffs and landings, a lot of hours in that Cub. I hired Ronald Skin from Selawik and Victor Carmen from Kotzebue for different projects, but in the middle of my stint there, there was interest in capturing geese for genetic studies and for banding. And we did not muster a big crew like you'll see later pictures of at Kayakuk. So myself and one of these other local guys would land with the Cub on a short lake where there were molting geese, park the plane as quick as we could, both bail out quick as we could, and start running after geese on the tundra. And so these guys were really, really good at running after geese on the tundra. And so I'd fill a gunny sack with 1 or 2 geese, and one of those guys would have 5, 6, 7, or 8 geese in a gunny sack. So they were really good at that. It was an exciting time for big game work as well. I was really impressed with the willingness and ability of Park Service, Fish and Wildlife Service, and Fish and Game to work very closely together on some pretty challenging projects involving radio collaring of caribou, moose, wolves, and wolverines, actually. And so on the left is Ted Spraker, chair of the Board of Game now. He's the one who taught me how to track wolves in snow from an airplane. And Doug Larson, another person I worked with who eventually became director of the Division of Wildlife Conservation. The first manager at Selawik Refuge, Kent Hall, had been a waterfowl biologist in the prairies. He was really good at understanding waterfowl ecology. One of the things that concerned him at the time is, like with the North Slope, there was quite a bit of interest in oil and gas in the Chukchi Sea. And so he was concerned about the effects of potential pollution on these estuaries of the Kobuk, Selawik, and Noatak rivers, and wanted to make a connection between the inland nesting activity and the coastal estuary for arrival and departing birds to gain nutrition. First when they arrive to the coast, gain nutrition before they go to nesting grounds, and then at the end of nesting to stock up on nutrition before they head south. And so we started a tundra swan collaring project and looked at where the birds nested and then where they spent their last few weeks in the area before they migrated south. And so we learned that these kind of lakes in the Kobuk Delta are really important nesting lakes, but then once that's done, they all move to these estuary areas on the river deltas and spend about a month there before migrating. They're the last to leave. ice is starting to form everywhere, and then the tundra swans clear out. When you're the only pilot up there for Fish and Wildlife, you often get drafted to do stuff you don't know anything about. And I didn't know anything about sea ice landings, but I learned quickly. I helped these guys probably 2 different winters, and their first winter up there was pretty shaky. We didn't have flight following. We had very poor communications. We had no GPS. And so the red lines are the support flights I made to radio track the polar bears before the collars got replaced, or find new ones for them to collar. And due to a Loran outage, the helicopter pilot could not find the people he had dropped off. This is like 60 miles offshore and nothing but whiteness. And so he exhausted all his fuel looking for him and had to set down. And so I'm the only one on the spot there, and I go to shore to get fuel. And while I'm going to shore, I hear 172 going overhead from Shishmaref to Kotzebue, and I said, "How much fuel you got on board?" And he says, "I've got hours." I said, "Could you look for these guys?" It was getting dark. And fortunately, those guys had a pen light, and they shined a light when that plane came near, and so he found them. He circled on station over them for probably 2 hours until I could get back to the helicopter. We could refuel the helicopter, and he could go retrieve the guys. There was an oncoming storm and very poor communications, so there's an imperative to get those guys out of there. Similar incident a few weeks later near Cape Lisburne. This time was a mechanical, a communications failure, and out of fuel. And I landed on the sea ice right at dusk. It's the only time I ever damaged a plane during a mission. It was very turbulent. I hit an ice ridge, either on landing or takeoff, I don't remember. Didn't even know it. Park superintendent and I shared that plane. Max Shaver was superintendent. He got really mad at me the next Monday when he went to fly, and he said, "You broke my wingtip." And I looked at it and said, "Oh, I didn't even know I did." It was one of those kind of flying days. I'm glad I don't have any more of those. Well, I had had enough for the coast, and so moved inland. Kayakuk Newitna Refuges was a combined refuge, now includes Anoka as well. Vast floodplains along the Kayakuk River, Anoka River, Newitna River. When we moved from Kotzebue to Galena, Pam had a dog team, and she mushed her dogs from Kotzebue all the way to Galena by way of Selwyn Hot Springs. And she arrived in Huslia right during the spring carnival, and you can imagine all the people from all the villages up and down the Kayakuk River and down as far down as Caltech and as upriver to Ruby all came to those carnivals for celebrations and for spectator sports of mushing. And this story got spread all around about this white woman moving from Kotzebue by dog team. And so when I went to villages and introduced myself, quite often it was the connection again that Pam had made with the local people that actually helped me in my job quite a bit. And so I was interviewing elders is one of the things I did, and of course that knowledge and that shared commonality of knowing something about dog mushing was important to have. So at Galena, even the refuge employees depend on the king salmon run, depend on the moose that they can hunt. So the folks there are in a really great situation to understand village life pretty well. But you go to the meetings and you hear the extreme importance of us recognizing subsistence resource values and protecting subsistence resources. So as assistant manager, I went there to be assistant manager at Kayakuk Refuge. Paul Liedberg, who some of you remember, went there to be assistant manager of Newitna Refuge. We both got there and the manager said, "Oh, I'm leaving in a month, and by the way, we're complexing. We're putting both refuges together, and you guys figure out how to do that." So we did, and we divided up villages. Paul did a certain bunch of villages, and I did a certain bunch of villages. But one thing we both heard was how important it was for us to take care of the subsistence resources. And some people you may remember, those of you who work in Fish and Wildlife, is Bob Schultz was my predecessor, manager of Canute Refuge. Winona Brown was subsistence coordinator, and Jack Riekoff is chair of the Western Regional Subsistence Advisory Council. One thing I heard loud and clear from the people was that white-fronted geese were declining. And when you hear that from people, it's usually their fault. Just like upriver, downriver salmon on the Yukon. It's upriver's fault. No, it's downriver's fault. I was trying to get to the bottom of this, and I started interviewing local people who grew up living a subsistence lifestyle. And at the time in the 90s, they were in their 70s, so I knew they depended on subsistence at a time when there was not much of a cash economy. Turned out I later developed a standardized questionnaire and asked about multiple subsistence resources in a consistent manner. At the time, I was also involved with the public radio station there, and we wanted local programming, so we were able to do a partnership project where these Raven Stories episodes were aired on public radio, but also archived with the University of Alaska University of Alaska Library Project Jukebox collection. So you can still go online right now, click on that image, and you'll pull up all 40 elders and you can select which interview you want to listen to. So at the time also, we had a pretty scattered out inventory monitoring program and decided we needed to make it more consistent. In 1992, we wrote an inventory monitoring plan. The manager at the time threatened that you're not going to do any more field work until this thing's written, so Mark Bertram was there with me, and we buckled down, spent the winter, he divided up different protocols and got them written up. And leadership came, and we trotted it out on the desk, and they said, how much is it going to cost? And we said $80,000 back in 1992. That's a lot of money. And the chief of refuges said, I can't afford that. And the assistant regional director was there, and he says, you make it happen. Too many times we need data. You make it happen. So back then they got a big slug of money added to their base budget for this, and they've been able to adhere to this plan all those years. The great benefit, of course, is that when you do have a declining situation, you now have some data to fall back on. In the case of the geese, we didn't have that because they'd already declined. But we could monitor it going forward. Some people you may know there, Jeff Beiersdorf worked out there for a while. PJ Simon worked out there as a biotech for a while. We hired a local person, Justin Patsy from Nolato, to help us navigate through the Cayuse Flats, which is an incredibly difficult place to find your way. Some of the benefits of these long-term data sets, just one example, this is aerial snow marker. You fly over once a month to get a snow depth reading. Dark line is snow depth, and so you have two peaks of snow depth here and here, and the light blue line is goose production, so you have a drop in goose production when snow is deeper, flooding. So when it floods from deep snow, goose production is suppressed. Jenny and Brad have also found a similar relationship with moose calving as well. So because of the declines, we looked back at the banding data that Jim King had done in the 70s and decided we better resume banding for survival analysis purposes mainly. And so we had the main method was much better than my Super Cub method. Is we used there we go. One Super Cub in the air directing 3 airplanes on the ground that would then taxi slowly and drive the birds into a net. Sometimes you'd have 500 geese to process. You'd be there half a day. But it's really valuable to get a lot of bands on the birds. We involved high school kids from McGrath and from Galena to get some local buy-in on this marking project, because sometimes marking is a controversial thing in villages, and it's important for people to understand why you're doing it. So again, this it's their fault kind of deal. People in the villages blame the sport hunters in the lower 48. Sport hunters in the lower 48 blame the spring hunting waterfowl by Alaska natives. Clearly, to get to the bottom of it, we're going to have to ramp up the studies. We're going to have to involve Canada, the Central States, and Mexico. And all of a sudden, this lowly biologist from the Yukon River community of Galena was going to flyaway meetings all over the Central States and to Mexico. And it was a pretty challenging time to get it figured out. But what we found out was that these birds here in the interior Alaska nest about 3 weeks earlier than the ones that nest all across the North Slope in Arctic Canada. So guess what? They arrive in Alberta and Saskatchewan 3 weeks early, and opening season September 1. So they're uniquely subject to higher hunting pressure. They arrive down here in Texas, same thing. They're uniquely exposed to more hunting pressure. And in Mexico, we had no idea what was going on. There was talk of drought. There's talk of cholera contamination of the few water bodies there. So we had to do work in Mexico. And so Deb Webb is here. She's the one who helped do all the satellite telemetry work. There's a picture of her using a Questar scope to read collars and on the banding in Alaska, and there's a shot of birds in Saskatchewan. So to figure out how to address studies in Mexico, we knew we couldn't do research in Mexico, just not practical. So we invited some graduate students that were highly recommended by their universities to come up and learn about the nesting areas, and then they returned to Mexico and did their master's projects on wintering white fronts. Manuel Ochoa did a project in the Central Highlands of Mexico, and Fabiola Yepes did one in the coastal plain of Tamaulipas. Manuel later went to work as a waterfowl biologist for Ducks Unlimited Mexico, working on waterfowl habitat conservation. And Fabiola is a professor of GIS at University of Nuevo León in Monterrey. These birds nest in a variety of places, from open tundra to riparian shrubs to old burns and thick forest. And they can nest 15 kilometers from the nearest wetland brood rearing habitat, and march their birds all the way down to the sloughs and rivers to raise their young. So by process of elimination, the Mexico studies told us it wasn't Mexico that was causing the problems. It wasn't flooding uniquely causing the problems in the nesting areas. So it was a hunting management problem. And as soon as the hunting seasons were adjusted, the population recovered. And so later on, P.J. Simon pointed at me at a meeting. I thought, oh, here it comes. He's mad at me for something. He pointed at me, he said, you helped bring back the white-fronted geese, thank you. So that felt pretty good. One of the things, interesting things we learned, these birds nesting on Kayakook Refuge north of Galena, like the swans at Selawik, went all the way to the coast, opposite the direction of their fall migration, to tank up on berries and coastal sedges, which were ideal for harvesting here, while here everything was already starting to die back from fall vegetation. And so then they're spending that 3 weeks to a month up there, then they shoot southeast direct, usually with a stop at Delta, and then from Delta a direct flight all the way to the prairies of Alberta and Saskatchewan. Pretty amazing. None of this could have been done without a lot of teamwork. Some of you know these folks, I'll point out a few. He's still there, Wayne Strasberg, maintenance worker, Karen Bedoni, outreach, Jeff Beiersdorf now with BLM, Orville Huntington. We hired him as a college student, and he was out there helping as a biologist and then later as a refuge information technician. Jenny Bryant, hired her right out of high school. Brad Scottons, their current supervisor biologist. Some of you guys may remember Greg McClellan working here in Fairbanks. He was subsistence coordinator. He became deputy out at Galena. And Joey Hundorf was our local hired pilot. So I learned some lessons there. It was a kind of an intermediate stop for me, out of basic training, no longer, now in a position of managing and running things. Make sure you do consistent efforts on inventory monitoring. Listen to all the stakeholders and genuinely listen. Try and keep an open mind to what you're hearing, and try, if things don't make sense, try to get a bigger picture of it. And then if you need to, get partners so you can leverage your activities. And if you need to, and I know it really scares a lot of people, work in other countries, because these things are all connected. Canada, Mexico, and further south with our land birds, they're really connected. So I went to Canudi in 2005, and the year before, they lost their major facility in Bettles. Canudi is different from the other places where I worked in that at Selawik, you're close to the villagers, you're close to the refuge. At Galena, you're right in the middle of the refuges and close to the villagers. So you're close to the resource, you're close to the resource users. In Fairbanks, we're sequestered in the federal building. We're 180 miles from the refuge. Unless we make major efforts to get out there regularly, sometimes it just doesn't happen. One thing that can make that easier is good facilities. So I arrived, and instead of running a refuge, I became a facility rebuilder. This building here was a school district building that the school had closed. The school was trying to unload it. The city was interested in buying it for $1 and then renting it back to us for $2,000 a month. We weren't too interested in that. I had to do major battle with the regional office to get them to accept the liability of an underground tank oil spill. And I was able to succeed because I brought an engineer up there who said, even at $70,000, this is a building that'll cost $1 million to replace. You need to get the building. So we did, and we did an energy upgrade. And it became a employee residence for our employee that's based in Biddles. The bunkhouse was separated from the office visitor center for safety reasons, and Park Service and I worked closely together on rebuilding. I was on the design team. They had a really creative architect, Brad Ritchie from the regional office, who had designed other visitor centers across the state. Designed a pretty energy efficient building, although I wish it was even more energy efficient now in retrospect, because when we were doing this we were looking at $4 a gallon heating oil, and it later went up to $10 a gallon there in Bettles. So I'm wishing we'd have made it with 3-foot thick walls instead of 1-foot thick walls. But the bunkhouse got built by Fish and Wildlife, with Fish and Wildlife funding, but we did a cooperative agreement with the park, so it was just one contractor and one project building both buildings. And we celebrated. It was a long time coming. The buildings burned in 04. It wasn't until 08 that we were actually rebuilding them. And so there's Pat Porchot. He was then Special Assistant to the Secretary of Interior for Alaska. Greg, who's here with us today, myself, and Vic Knox. I'm pretty sure I got his name right. He was Assistant Regional Director at the time? Retired. Okay. But I got to emphasize that with a refuge that far away, and Arctic's even further away, you need these field facilities to be able to operate safely. So one example is the importance of the hangar and the shop for supporting interagency projects. And this is a moose census that's occurring in cooperation with Fish and Game, BLM, and Park Service. And so we got a few fish and game biologists there in the picture, Cale and Kelly Tom Seaton, Glenn Stout was the area biologist, migratory birds pilot, Karen Bollinger, and Lisa Saperstein was our former biologist here. Jim McCarron's in the audience. Don Carlson's retired. There's the Fish and Game Scout. There's the Fish and Wildlife Scout, which has become an endangered species. I won't elaborate on that. When you have people in remote places and they have to come to town for training in summer, it's really difficult to find a hotel room. And if you have volunteers coming to help Canuti, it's really difficult because of all the bureaucratic problems we've created for ourselves to find a hotel room and put them in it. And so Elisa's in the audience today, and I showed pictures of this building that needed lots of love. It was on a place called Schooner Bend at the Kenai Refuge, and looked kind of sad. But I asked Elisa, well, do you know anything about that? Because she had contacts at Kenai, and she said, well, I've actually stayed in there, and it's nice inside. So with that gamble, we decided to move it to Fairbanks. It didn't look very appealing right when it got here, but with a lot of work and tender loving care, it's become a pretty important resource for us to operate in Bush, Alaska, because you need to support your Bush, Alaska people here in the urban areas. Similarly, we had a person working up in Coldfoot. It was working in a pretty marginal building that was designed for summer use. Over the years, we put a lot of effort into insulating it better. Then our team went in there summer before last and raised it up, put it on a new foundation, and put more insulation under the floor. Then we got a contractor to go inside and do a complete renovation inside and energy upgrade. And it's a dry building. It's fairly simple to maintain. But I'm proud to say that this visitor reception area now will accommodate aurora viewing tourists that are traveling the Dalton Highway. This week was our soft opening. So as we speak, we have a volunteer from Northern Alaska Tour Company, who's also a Fish and Wildlife volunteer, former Fish and Wildlife employee, former Park Service employee, who's bringing her tour groups through that area. And I think it's important, as I'll get to in a minute, that in summer visitation on our areas, or fall visitation, you've got hunters, fishers, hikers, campers, floaters. We're kind of preaching to the choir when we're talking to those folks. But on the Dalton Highway, people going up there don't necessarily want to do outdoor stuff. They want to see the Northern Lights, and tend to be a different demographic, about 2/3 international, but about 1/3 American domestic, tend to be pretty wealthy, we're reaching demographic here. You know, guess why you can see the northern lights really good? Because you're surrounded by public lands. It's a very compelling interpretive opportunity that I wanted to make sure we were seizing upon. Now with all our budget cuts and staff cuts, it's going to be challenging to run it, but we think with a public-private partnership, working with the tour companies, we can sustain this effort. I got really frustrated with a generator that wouldn't start and had a hard time pumping gas downhill to an airplane. It seemed really stupid. So got some solar panels and changed the pump to 12 volts and had a very sustainable way to pump avgas. Similarly, had a scary incident flying propane to the Canudi cabin and had to fly it multiple times this summer to run the refrigerator, and decided, well, it's time to put solar at Canudi cabin to refrigerate stuff for our field crews so that they can stay there with good supply of groceries that's not dependent on fossil fuels. We later had an opportunity with stimulus funding to put PV arrays at both our buildings in Bettles and solar thermal at both our buildings, and they're working really well. When you have more buildings, it's more work. So my former deputy, Joanna, and I were having problems keeping the bunkhouse nice. And so we'd often, when we were there, give it a deep cleaning. And so we put this picture on the door, kind of subliminal message to people staying there that they could do the same thing. Unlike Kaikanuitna, Canudi struggled to have an inventory monitoring plan. Some of you may remember Patsy Martin. Anybody raise your hand if you overlap with Patsy? Okay. She was the first pilot biologist at Canudi. And after she heard we had a working inventory monitoring plan in '92, she wanted help getting one going for Canudi. So I helped write a few protocols back in 1994. And with starts and stops and changes in policy and changes in formats and changes in people, here it was, 2017, we were still struggling to get it done. But we did get it done and it's finally signed. So going forward now, I hope we have a continued inventory monitoring effort. We had to write a new protocol because we had an incursion of caribou coming out of the refuge and didn't have a good way to enumerate how many were using the refuge. So we added that at the last minute. Another really exciting thing for me to have done there is this time a 4-agency cooperative study on moose. There's a concern that Dalton Highway is kind of being a vacuum cleaner for moose, that easy access near the Dalton was drawing moose away from good habitats. They're getting harvested along the Dalton. Those concerns were expressed in villages. Also, with a lot of big fires, we were interested in looking at habitat use following fire. And so we put together this project. It actually originated because we didn't have enough snow cover to do moose survey one year. So every agency pooled their moose survey money to get collars. We collared over 100 moose. I think 4 papers have been published so far. In answer to the question, the Dalton Highway is not sucking moose off the rest of the areas. And we did see some migratory behavior, but not as much as has been seen elsewhere. Thanks to the work of Chris Harwood, who's been our resident biologist at Canudi for upwards of 15 years now, I think we've got a pretty good handle on our avian resources, and the inventory monitoring plan can address that. Going forward, it's going to be really hard to prioritize which ones we're going to have funding to do, but at least we've got a sense of that. Where I think the challenges for Canudi is going to be is related to the easy access afforded by the Dalton Highway and the interest in other economic development sectors of the state to encourage mining and access. And so the left photo and the bottom photo is an incident that occurred 2 summers ago where a BLM permitted mine didn't have surface access over the BLM lands, but South Fork of the Kaikuk River is state navigable waters. And so they used the road, they used the river as a road, going gravel bar to gravel bar during low water. And that can be done if it's done carefully and before fish are present for spawning. In this incident, it was 2 weeks after the cutoff date, so fish had already laid eggs in those riffles, which is really damaging. It's really hard for me to see that. And I think we need to make sure that stuff doesn't happen anymore. But also of concern is expansion of placer activities. This excavation just went in last summer. One of the advantages for me being a pilot manager is that I could kind of keep tabs with these kind of activities. I've seen siltation, I've seen pollution, I've seen a lot of damaging things that concern me going forward. And I think I need to work really closely, and my successors will need to work really closely with BLM and the state to alleviate impacts downstream to community refuge. It's my biggest worry. We have some pretty decent water resources baseline data. We have in-stream flow for 6 years, and we have contaminants information for 6 years worth. It's a start. We've also got some hydrological modeling been done. But I think going forward, we need to have a quick response plan, because when these things let loose, when a placer mine lets a settling pond loose, it's a sudden event, and I think we need to be prepared to monitor that at a moment's notice. And again, my worry is that Arctic Refuge, with all the resources it may take going forward, will there be resources to do this kind of work also? Another advantage of being the refuge manager and a pilot is that I could keep tabs on how the moose season's going. I never carried a badge, but I flew a lot of officers around to do enforcement work. And my main point here is that at meetings we often hear criticism in the villages towards sport hunters, saying they're the reason moose are declining, and it's this competition, we can't get our moose. And so manager's responsible for delving into that and figuring out what the real situation is. And so there is a controlled use area, and Joanna helped me put this sign up years ago. And so downriver from that is local people only and no aircraft. So the existing controlled use area does a good job of separating the village-based hunters from the Dalton Highway fly-in or float-in hunters or boat-in hunters. So we think those conflicts, while perceived, are probably not serious yet, but it's something we need to continue to keep an eye on. And then, of course, working closely with Fish and Game, making sure we're looking at the moose survey data and the harvest data, that we don't exceed a sustainable harvest recommendation. In doing the enforcement patrols, I have found a lot of things on the refuge that do concern me and upset me when I see people treat our public lands this way. We've had wanton waste cases. We've had trespass cabins. We even had an aircraft airstrip built on the refuge in a wetland refuge. It was pretty amazing to see that. We've had air taxi outfitters leave stuff in the field for a week at a time that ends up being a bear attractant. So I'm concerned about that. Without regular law enforcement presence, this stuff tends to kind of gradually build up. So going forward, I'm really hoping that the service, Fish and Wildlife Service, can muster consistent effort. It doesn't take a lot, but it takes consistent effort. Canudi has never had, in my tenure, a refuge information technician. There was one stationed at Bettles years ago. He lived in Ellicachet, but he was stationed in Bettles. It's really hard to maintain a village-based person with our bureaucratic and computer and IT standards and training standards now. And so to short-circuit that process, we made a contract arrangement with the Ellicachet Tribal Council, and they selected Stephen Bergman to be their employee that helps us in a liaison fashion. So Stephen is the state license vendor there in Ellicachet. He also issues the federal subsistence permits. Whenever we have a meeting, he helps facilitate it. Whenever we have a logistical need, he helps with it. And likewise, when the village needs help, we come and help them, and he lets us know when they need help, for example, a search and rescue. One of the things Stephen helped at recently is the logistics to support the Henshaw Creek Science Camp. And this is a really unique opportunity where Tanana Chiefs Fisheries Division is under agreement with Fish and Wildlife Service Office of Subsistence Management to run a fish escapement weir on Henshaw Creek, just upriver from Ellicachet. Towards the end of the run, the biologists worked together with the elders and with the community refuge staff to host students from Ellicachet and some of the surrounding villages in an educational week at Henshaw. And it's a really great opportunity to reach kids and get them inspired. And that's a memorable picture from that I took, is just when you can inspire a kid like that. This gal almost decided to study fish and wildlife at UAF. She then changed her mind and went into social work. But I keep trying, and I think us fish and wildlife employees need to keep trying. We do community events, thanks to Elisa's creativity and Joanna's creativity in the past, and now our staff work together to host these. They're somewhat challenging logistically for us, but we go to Alacaca once a year, have a big community potluck in the school. We have school educational visits. We have a poster session for the people in the village, and they look at some of the work we've done, and we have a lot of good dialogue. Same at Bettles. It's an outdoor event at Bettles during the when the Park Service is ramping up with their seasonal rangers. But the posters that we've developed for Alacaca get recycled to the Bettles Visitor Center, so our message is getting out there rather well. Dragonfly Day is a great opportunity. All three refuges and other divisions and fisheries and ecological services help with hosting this event, where the public is invited to Chino Lakes to appreciate dragonflies and wetland habitats. And it's an amazing opportunity. And I'm not an outreachy kind of guy, but it's important for me to put my mind into the mind of an outreachy kind of person and help and be there and actually witness the inspiration of the public that occurs at an event like this. I often reflected over the years that I'm flying over a refuge that looks very different than what my predecessor, pilot biologist Patsy Martin, experienced. At the time Patsy flew over Canuti, it was mostly old growth spruce lichen forest with a few burns. I've flown over it after 2 extreme fire years and some intermediate fire years, and it's mostly successional birch and shrub. And actually in some places the birch and shrub are reburning and they look like grasslands. It's a very different looking place than what Patsy experienced. And then I started seeing these things and started seeing these things. So I sent her those photos and I said, "Did you see anything like this when you were flying?" And she said, "No, this is something I never saw." So I was lucky to spend a week with Mark Clark. We dug 35 soil pits all over the refuge, looking at permafrost depth and soil types. And so we've got to start to have a handle on this physical change. It's just a very basic thing, but it's something we're going to have to pay a lot more attention to going forward. Invasive weeds on the Dalton Highway is a threat if the Ambler Road is built, or other spur roads like the Tramway Bar Road, Chapman Creek Road, or Marion Creek Road. I think we're going to see more permits for spur roads off the Dalton, even if we don't see the Ambler Road. This is bad stuff. The white sweet clover and the bird vetch have the ability to alter habitats, and it's really, really important that we do more than just the Band-Aid of holding our finger in the dike and doing some weeding around the bridges. And it's going to take a concerted effort by multiple parties working together to keep those weeds out. And I think there may be some leverage with if the Ambler Road or some of these other spur roads might be some leverage. I think the Elodia battle has informed a lot of people here in Fairbanks. A little more sympathetic ear to the use of chemicals or more extreme measures to keep these damaging plants from entering our environment. Canuti has a long tradition of floating down rivers off the Dalton Highway, started by Deputy Manager Barry Whitehill, and then also Deputy Manager Mary Maxwell, back into the mid and early 90s. And then I continued that. It's a very important way for refuge staff to get familiar with a very economical access to the refuge off the Dalton Highway. And a lot of hunters inquire about it. They wonder about the conditions, and so it's important for the staff to understand what it's like to access the refuge off the highway. Our latest float trip was 2 summers ago, and the main purpose was to get more familiar with the BLM permitted placer mining activities along the South Fork, just so our staff knows what it looks like on the ground. And there's the Canuti staff taken at our last meeting. We have annual planning meetings, and boy, they are an awesome staff. And none of this stuff could have been done without everybody pitching in. So I've had a chance to fly over some incredible landscapes in Alaska in my career, and I've done a lot of reflection on what's happening and the trends, and I just talked about mining and at placer access. And so I started thinking about, we have this great system of conservation units throughout the state, but what we're not taking care of is the areas that connect them. And so here, an 8 to 10 mile wide corridor, which doesn't constitute a lot of acreage, will link 50 million acres of conservation lands. And here, these 6 corridors will link 27 million acres of lands. And so this analysis was done, sponsored by the Northwest Boreal LCC, by Don Magnus at Kenai Refuge, and Amanda Robertson, now Sesser with the LCC. I ultimately became co-chair, U.S. co-chair of the Northwest Boreal LCC, and I did it because of the passion that I developed after flying over all these intact landscapes in Alaska and understanding that these things continue all the way up to the headwaters of the Yukon River. And without a bunch of people at the table that have management authority, and without people at the table from both sides of the border, we can't really do a good job of conserving large landscapes. So this group of words here was just put together by the steering committee one year when we were talking about what our priority interests were. We've had several meetings. We have normally 2, sometimes only 1 face-to-face meeting, but multiple teleconferences throughout the year. And here you have this broad partnership with 30 different groups on both sides of the border that are trying to come up with prioritized information needs and prioritized shared goals and objectives for moving the conservation needle forward in this big geography. One real highlight is the Beacons Project. I'll just briefly go into it, but the LCC helped sponsor that with the Yukon College and University of Alberta. This is an area over towards the Peel River and the Mackenzie Mountains in Yukon. But you can, with modeling and the use of priority species or focal species, you can decide on what's called an ecological benchmark. In more popular parlance, it would be a protected area that would be used as a control in an experiment, where this land here would be multiple use land that might involve forestry or mining or other development. This land would be your benchmark that you're using to monitor effects on this side of the border and this side of the border to see what's happening to the environment. You'd be looking at several variables at once. In this case, the goal is gold placer claims are indicated here as yellow. So you could choose a benchmark that would have minimal conflict with mining. I wish we'd have done that with some of our Alaska refuges back when ANILCA was being talked about, because we're setting ourselves up for a lot of resource conflicts now that are going to have to be worked out with other ways. In Yukon, they have the luxury right now as almost a blank slate. The Peel River decision was just issued last month. It opened up land use planning throughout Yukon territory, and so I think you're going to see some very creative stakeholder-driven planning efforts that will result in some protected areas in the headwaters of our Yukon River drainage here in Alaska. So one of the privileges I've had is taking people out into Alaska bush to see the villages, to see the refuges, people who don't normally get out there in the course of their jobs. And I found it really inspiring to see their reactions and to help inspire them so that they could get better connected with the landscapes. I did that also with our leadership, and we can get kind of cynical about our leadership sometimes, but without taking them out in the field, showing them the resources, showing them the facilities, having them meet folks in the village, having good dialogue, letting them recharge their batteries and think about it, I think it's going to benefit conservation going forward. So I made quite a bit of efforts to do that. As well with other agency leaders. This is Tim Lamar with the BLM, and it was his first chance to see the Ray Mountains on a beautiful day. We were caribou tracking, thanks to Aaron here, set that up for us. But again, it helps Tim put in context where Canudi sits among all the BLM lands, where they're going to be making decisions in the next decade that affect the health of our refuge. I think my scariest talk ever was before the Fairbanks Chamber of Commerce. And regional director at the time, Rowan Gould, was meeting with us about the Canudi Comprehensive Conservation Plan. And I remember these words vividly. I don't care what the environmental groups think about your plan. I want to know what the Chamber of Commerce thinks about your plan. Well, I thought, man, am I scared to death to even go talk to them. And so we did go talk to them and actually received a fairly favorable reception from a committee that oversaw what would be on their agenda. Well, we then went to their full membership with some notions about conservation planning on Canudi back in 2007. And a lot of people filled out a questionnaire at the end of our talk, and they were like 95% favorable to what we were doing at Canute. There were only a few flyers out there that said, let the bulldozers and oil derricks go. Most of them were supportive. And so in this climate that we're facing now politically in Alaska, there's some stuff we need to think about is how we craft our message back to the public. So wildlife and wildlands are important to Alaskans. That's why we live here. 70% of our voters report taking a wildlife viewing trip. Half the people come to do tourism in Alaska, include wildlife viewing as one of the things they want to do. And then to the economy. I couldn't believe those numbers when I saw it, but I rechecked. This is a recent report from the Outdoor Industry Association. Look at the amount of money people spend in Alaska on these outdoor activities that depend on open spaces and public land. Look at how much is wages and salaries. 20% of all jobs depend on that. And that amount of state and local tax revenue. These are things that we need to really emphasize going forward. Canute Cabin sits on this lake. It's a really, really special place. There were times when myself and other staff members went up there to do work. But it's really important to just sit down on the porch of the cabin and absorb the environment and the peace and quiet and the silence and the fact that this river is flowing naturally. It's rising and falling naturally. In the lower 48, they have to buy land, they have to buy water, they have to buy electricity to pump the water, they have to maintain dikes to control the water, to make wetlands that waterfowl can winter on. Whereas at Canute, all we got to do is keep the water going like it's been for centuries and work with the local people to get everybody on the same page that keeping these habitats natural and free are really important things to do. So take time to pick the berries and enjoy the times you do have out in the field, to look at the northern lights from, that's our field headquarters in Bettles. Now I'm going to take us down a notch. This is the most horrible day in my life at work. And I got a call from Megan, my niece, the winter before this. This was summer 2013. Well, I have a chance to work on a fish weir in Alaska, and I really want to go to Alaska. I really want to. But I also have a chance to work on this project with sturgeon on the Missouri River. And I said, well, what do you want to do going forward after this? Well, I want to work on a master's. Well, working with this PhD guy is going to help you achieve that master's. Being on a fish weir, you'll get a good feeling for logistics in Alaska conditions, but it won't prepare you for a master's very well. So she chose to go to South Dakota and work under Dr. Rob Klum. She'd only been there about a month and a half. They were working on a boat in front of a motel, getting ready to launch it the next day, and they were hit by a drunk driver and killed instantly. And all of a sudden I found myself in the position of being the family liaison between a grieving family and the Fish and Wildlife Service, and it was not a good position to be in. And so I decided after that I was going to take some actions to make sure no other person gets in that position, that the service appoints a family liaison that's skilled at dealing with that kind of stuff, and that we do a better job looking at our safety record. So I did that for Alaska. I went back to all the fatalities. We've lost almost 2/3 of our people to airplane crashes and almost 1/3 to boating accidents. And so that was my wake-up call on aviation safety, because at the same time I was seeing some trends in our aviation program that were alarming me in terms of our ability to train new pilots. So I spent a lot of time trying to overhaul and help create new policy to improve training of our pilots. It also got me thinking about how important it is to care about our workers that are in remote places, that we don't share that lifestyle anymore. I got a call at 2 in the morning when the Galena dike was about to break during the 2013 flood. And I called around trying to find help, because they had 3 or 4 airplanes there. They were worried they were going to get lost because of the flood. So I gathered up some pilots and flew a government plane 2 in the morning out there to help them move planes out of Galena to Ruby. I went back 3 more times to help to pull insulation out, to take VIPs out there. to take maintenance workers out there. And it's something that all hazard response, all of us in the agencies need to be available to, at a moment's notice, help out with something like that. And to really show we care about those folks. They were partly left out to dry by our agency. It was not as good of a situation as it should have been. I was glad to hear at the pilot meeting last week that the agency did rally for Puerto Rico, where we have 61 employees in different facilities down there. They sent 3 planes down to help take care of those people. Each person working there got $22,000 worth of cash, advance payment, because the banking wasn't working. And so I think we got our act together, and I'd like to see that kind of stuff. The other thing is families and children. I, having been a parent also, and I remember a time when Pam was gone and planes had to get moved off the lake because the lake was freezing. I had to go to the river, so I put both kids in the back of the Cub and moved the plane out to the river. And just understanding what parents go through and trying to balance career and job, and been very eager to see parents, if they have to, bring their kids to work. But it also puts you in touch with why we're here and why we do conservation, because we want to see these kind of intact landscapes and healthy environments for our children. So I'm going to let you read those on your own. I'm not going to repeat it, but those are some of the lessons I learned in this journey. So again, those intact landscapes, fire up that heart. Use it to develop your passion. Use it to help protect these habitats for the generations to come. 42 years, boy, it's been a long time. It went by really fast, and I told my kids, I said, find a job that you really like, because I really liked it. I looked forward to coming to work most days, and it's been a great ride. Got to do a lot of really amazing things. And I'm not leaving Alaska. I'm not leaving Fairbanks. I'm going to continue to volunteer to be co-chair of the Northwest Boreal LCC, and also volunteer for Fish and Wildlife Service and the Yukon River Intertribal Watershed Council. That's one of our partner organizations. As I mentioned, I'm excited about what our LCC can do by working together. This is a time when people really need to be uniting, and so the opportunity to unite is really strong. I found a real vacuum on the Canada side of the border, a vacuum of opportunities to cooperate with Alaskans on these issues, and LCC helps serve to fill that vacuum. You know, as I said, I think we may have some opportunities for some real significant conservation gains in Canada, because their politics are way different than ours right now, and they just unfroze land use planning in Yukon, and NWT government is also involved in, because of settlement with indigenous peoples, it's mandated that they do land use planning. And I just appreciate everything that you guys do for conservation and for wise use of our resources in Alaska. And I'll see you around. Any questions? Roger.
Well, I don't have a question, Mike, but I just wanted to say thanks for sharing these perspectives and this bit of our history, and especially having worked with you for almost 40 years now, I want to express a real appreciation for the wide range of skills and interests and concerns that you brought to the job. It was really uncommon. Things like being a pilot and refuge manager and a biologist and a naturalist, but I guess especially your sensitivity to some of the wilderness values and especially the local people, that is very valued. Thanks.
Well, I've been having some conversations with our leadership to try and impart some of these same messages, so I'm hopeful that some of these messages won't get lost. And thank you for the kind words. Any other questions or observations? I've had a chance to work with a lot of you in this room, and in retirement I will miss that a lot, because it's really the caliber of the people that we've worked with over the years that have helped us keep these refuges the way they are, and will help us keep them viable and protected in the future. But I know I've worked with a lot of you guys over the years, so and I hope to see you Maybe at Fred Meyer's, but maybe at a conservation meeting. Fran?
Just one quick comment. I think you, as Roger mentioned, and what you've demonstrated here in this presentation is a very impressive contribution to conservation that you've done. And just throw out a comment that I don't think you, this is my opinion, I don't think that contribution can be made when management people come to these places and stay for 2 or 3 years and go. I think if the service can get a dedicated person such as yourself to devote their career and stay productive as you've done, that's how the public gets served best.
It is really a heavy thing being a public servant. And, you know, at first I thought, well, it's just this cool job and I have fun doing it, and not many people get to do this. But as I later had more responsibilities, there are absolutely huge frustrations. And one of them is this revolving door of leadership. And I've been very clear in my messaging to our leadership as I go out the door myself that just what you said, that we need some old Alaska hands to be running refuges and in our regional leadership. And I'm hoping the message is listened to. I think it might be. I think I'm optimistic that I've had some impact. There are some forces at work that are really beyond our control now with what's going on in Congress and the economy and taxation. And so I do see some challenging times, but I also see some need for creativity. And one of the aspects that I brought to our leadership is that you need a refuge manager to be the vocal stewardship element that's out in the communities and with the stakeholders and has the credibility of being the manager, but you can't make that person go to 100 communities. You got to have a manageable number of communities they deal with, and really one refuge and the communities around it is a manageable size. So don't get rid of that manager, nurture it, bring it up from the bottom, hire new biological technicians like those Bollier pictures I showed, that sooner or later those will become leaders. They have good foundations. And the other aspect is that the biologist, they want to have these roving teams of biologists that go around the state doing stuff. And I said, well, with that manager that's the face of the refuge and the advocate and the steward of the refuge, you also need the biologist who is the land expert or fish expert on that piece of geography. That biologist working together with that manager is the minimum you're going to need for stewardship. You can have these roving teams of people that do other stuff because we're going to get diluted, and I think it's an alarming trend. But if we can preserve that manager, biologist, and community and land relationship, I think we'll be able to survive till the tides turn. I hope. Greg.